we played the Symphonie Fantastique, an extraordinary composition in every respect. In that work, the French composer Hector Berlioz took the classical Viennese tradition of symphonic writing, as it had developed through Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven, and within just 2 or 3 years of Beethoven's death, turned the whole thing right on its head. But actually, did those long-cherished classical abstract principles simply disappear with the onslaught of Romanticism? No, of course not. Now, a man who revered those techniques, who understood them and breathed new life into them, making them his own, was Johannes Brahms. The finale of the Fourth Symphony of Johannes Brahms, the work that concerns us in this program. Brahms, conservative, classicist, reactionary, stuffy. Poor old Brahms. He has been called some names in his time. A throwback from a bygone age, said his contemporaries. Has he no idea of the avant-garde, the music of the future, the achievements of progressives like Berlioz, Liszt, and Wagner? He was a young man when he started work on his first symphony, but from first note to last, it was to take him the best part of 20 years. It was referred to, rather slightingly, as Beethoven's 10th. Brahms, said the composer and critic Hugo Wolf, writes symphonies regardless of what has happened in between. Hugo Wolf was particularly vicious about Brahms's Fourth Symphony. He could never rise above mediocrity, but such nothingness, such hollowness, such mousy obsequiousness as this has never yet been revealed so alarmingly in any of Brahms's works. The art of composing without ideas has decidedly found in Brahms one of its worthiest representatives. Like God Almighty, Brahms understands the trick of creating something out of nothing. Yes, well, and if you feel that there's already too much strong language on television, you just wait for the next program when I tell you what Tchaikovsky thought of Brahms. That'll really make your hair curl. To us today, such criticisms seem totally ludicrous. Oh, agreed, Brahms in his symphonies, and indeed in all his music, was his own man. In his formal control, his harmonic language, the integrity of his materials, and in dozens of other ways, he was a conservative, working in a classical tradition. At a time in the 19th century when Wagner and Berlioz went in for big, lavish instrumental textures, Brahms was content to use a conventional, relatively small, Beethoven-sized orchestra. But is that a handicap? To almost all of us, is he not the soul of lyricism, of melody, of romance? Brahms was born in 1833, and he died in 1897, age 63. Everything he wrote displays superb craftsmanship, a traditional, classical sense of order and design. But was he not a romantic at heart? He certainly had enough romantic attachments. The girls fell at his feet. But he did remain all his life a bachelor. When Brahms was 20, he met Robert Schumann. Schumann was an influential critic as well as a composer, generously praising Brahms to the skies. 3 years later, Schumann died, and Brahms fell head over heels for Schumann's widow, Clara. Clara Schumann, 14 years older than Brahms, was the first truly internationally renowned woman pianist. Somehow she managed to bring up her 7 children and at the same time pursue her career as a concert pianist. Today, in a totally different world, in a different age, she and Brahms might well have married, who knows? But Clara's life was dedicated to the memory of her husband and to her own career. Brahms respected Clara's musicianship as much as he loved her as a person, and he turned to her constantly for advice, sending her his new compositions, seeking her criticism and guidance, and they maintained an enduring friendship all their lives. Oh, there were other attachments, mainly singers, but composition was his life, and he was his own fiercest critic. Ruthlessly, he would tear up any page of manuscript or even entire compositions if he wasn't totally happy with them, or if he considered them in the least unripe or unworthy. So consequently, he left behind no works that are incomplete, or which might betray indecision or the slightest failure of inspiration. And that is why everything he left behind is so durable. His orchestral music especially has implanted itself firmly in the concert hall repertory. Despite all changes of fashion, his music remains a challenge to play, but ever fruitful, ever rewarding. His 4 symphonies are staples of the repertoire, and rightly so. But he had reached the age of 40 before he felt confident enough to present his first symphony to the public. And he wasn't in the least chastened when critics compared its song-like finale to the last movement of Beethoven's choral symphony. Well, any donkey can see that, he said. His musical personality is rich in lyricism, expressiveness, and he has a most distinctive tone of voice. Brahms's music, like that of, Schubert or Chopin, is instantly recognizable, with a powerful rhythmic and harmonic style that resembles nobody else. But on top of all this, Brahms had a highly developed sense of balance and formal proportion. It's the combination of all these qualities that gives his music such unique powers of endurance. Of all his contemporaries, Brahms was the composer who had the most scholarly, sensitive, and sympathetic knowledge of the musical heritage of the past. But this was no mere antiquarian collector's interest. From childhood, he loved the music of Bach, Handel, and other Baroque composers such as the French keyboard virtuoso François Couperin. As a boy in Hamburg, he was always hunting around antiquarian bookshops or digging out old music manuscripts from the city library to copy out and study. This great enthusiasm for early music stayed with him, and as a musicologist, he edited such music for publication. It also inspired him as a composer. He loved using traditional musical techniques, theme and variations, fugues, sonata form, and so on, which, as far as most of his contemporaries were concerned, were out of date. But to him, they came completely naturally. He had an innate need for the discipline of form. Consequently, the art of taking a theme and writing a set of variations upon it held a particular fascination for Brahms, as it had for Beethoven. It gave him great fluency in handling symphonic material, because it taught him how to reveal fresh aspects of a musical idea time and again, to organize a wealth of detail within a large-scale, clearly perceived framework. Now, later in this program, we shall perform his 4th symphony, a work which clearly demonstrates this massive architectural sense, a quality that gives his music an ageless appeal, placing it, like the music of Bach, like the piano concertos of Mozart, or the quartets of Beethoven, above and beyond any changes in public taste. And really, you know, this is extraordinary when you consider that here we have a composer who never went in for anything flashy or gimmicky. Take, for example, his orchestration. Now, on his own admission, Brahms said that he did not think naturally in terms of orchestral color. Nevertheless, Brahms's orchestration is totally personal. When he thickens the orchestral texture, especially in the richly voiced lower registers, it is never from ineptitude, but because that particular sound is an integral expression of what he has to say. When, for example, he divides his violas and cellos so as to get that Brahmsian warmth and richness of sound. The inventiveness in such a passage is not the sort of inventiveness that proclaims itself from the rooftops. No, it's something far more subtle. In this case, entrusting the melody to the violas, played normally with the bows, but doubled by the violins plucked. Now, that type of inventiveness is characteristic of him. In an age of outspoken egoists, Brahms was basically a reserved man, although he could put on a sociable air of bonhomie when he chose. He let his music stand on its own merits. Against his will, he found himself chosen as the symbol of the anti-Wagnerian faction in the musical world. The battle of words that raged between the Wagnerites and the Brahmsians seems ludicrous today. And when the dust had settled, it was another composer, Schoenberg of all people, who put the matter into perspective, because he wrote an essay entitled Brahms the Progressive, where he demonstrated that modern music owes quite as much to Brahms as it does to Wagner. That's an attitude that would have been dismissed as utterly preposterous in Brahms's lifetime, and for years afterwards. Indeed, Brahms's symphonies needed time in many countries to find an established place in the repertory. For instance, in Germany, of all places, my own father, when he was a young man, was a member of a Brahms club, an organization to help promote his music. And in 1900, when Symphony Hall was being built in Boston, Massachusetts, in the States, the joke went round Boston that the required exit signs over the doors really should say, exit in case of Brahms, for his music was regarded as turgid and difficult to understand, and old-fashioned to boot. Now, George Bernard Shaw, in his years as music critic, could never resist twisting the knife. 18th June, 1890. My temper was not improved by Brahms' symphony in E minor. He takes an essentially commonplace theme and gives it a strange air by dressing it in the most elaborate and far-fetched harmonies. Strip off the euphemism from these symphonies, and you will find a string of incomplete dance and ballad tunes, following each other with no more organic coherence than the succession of passing images reflected in a shop window in Piccadilly during any 20 minutes in the day. Brahms's enormous gift of music is paralleled by nothing on earth but Mr. Gladstone's gift of words. It is a verbosity which outfaces its own commonplaceness by dint of sheer magnitude. He is insufferably tedious. His symphonies are endured as sermons are endured. Well, so much for George Bernard Shaw. But remarks like those really tell us more about GBS than they do about Brahms. Clearly, he found it incomprehensible that Brahms should choose resolutely to work in traditional forms, theme and variations, concerto symphonies, and so on. But their musical inventiveness is of the essence. You have no Wagnerian plot or subplot to give you a storyline, a structure. There's no Irish actress, if you remember a la Berlioz, to inspire you. But to us, Brahms is someone whose music is the very embodiment of the Germanic symphonic tradition. that ability to create an entire musical edifice from half a dozen snippets of notes and rhythms. Beethoven had carried that idea to the most extraordinary lengths. In our last program, we saw how 3 Gs and an E flat generated the enormous architectural span of the Fifth Symphony. And now, halfway through this series of programs, we have reached, in Brahms, a figure of paramount significance in the central development of that classical ideal. Looking at the broad spectrum of the symphony, we can see how different composers at different times have taken the very notion of the symphony and used it to their own ends. In earlier programs, we saw its growth in the 18th century, its maturity in Haydn and Mozart, its violent transformation in the imagination of Beethoven. And more recently, we looked at Berlioz, a composer who revered Beethoven, changing its contours yet again. And that was an expression of a wild, tortured, impulsive, fantastic imagination, but still, it was a symphony. But if we look at the symphonies of Brahms, we can see why composers of every period persist in writing on that scale. The single, uncluttered reason why composers take up the challenge. The answer is that the symphony, more than any other musical discipline, cannot be, how shall I say, faked. I better explain what I mean. Other forms of musical expression, opera, ballet, choral works, concertos, and so on, can, in a sort of way, cheat. Because in an opera or a ballet, you have a story and scenery and staging and lighting, costumes, etc., to, if you like, distract the audience. In a concerto, well, there's always the charisma of the soloist or the sheer brilliance of the playing to get you out of possible trouble. But in a symphony, the only thing to be judged is the quality of the composer himself and his ability to develop his musical ideas. So what does that mean? What is musical development? Well, it's the very essence of symphonic thought. So let us spend the rest of this program examining how Brahms set about it. Essentially, musical development is a process where germs of ideas expand, mature, flourish, according to the skill of the composer. Now that is how Brahms starts his Fourth Symphony, with a gently seesawing phrase on the violins. At one stage, he toyed with the idea of putting a few bars introduction up in front, but he decided against the idea, rightly so. Instead, he starts straight in, dee-dam, a drop of a third, and then ba-dam, if I could sing in tune, a rise of a sixth, immediately balanced by a similar pattern. And that, in turn, is also balanced. And notice, each of those starts on a weak beat, which propels it forward. This rocking, offbeat feeling is emphasized by the woodwind, who echo the tune. And that rocking offbeat feeling is reinforced by the accompaniment in the lower strings, an undercurrent that rises and falls. To this, he adds 4 notes going down the scale, which appears simultaneously as, and so he moves into the cadence, like this. Now, already Brahms, in only 18 bars, has presented a whole wealth of ideas ripe for development. And that's immediately what he does. with an abundance of decorative detail. The melody is in broken octaves. Simultaneously, another version of the same melody appears elsewhere, weaving in and out. And to add yet another layer of ingenuity, the theme also appears in the cellos and basses. So, already, you see, there's an extraordinary and ingenious three-way development taking place. Three versions presented all at the same time, and each version different from its neighbors. Now, here it is, everything fitted together. But soon after this point, Brahms takes our attention to a new idea. And suddenly, we're in the middle of a lush, romantic melody accompanied by what, unmusicologically, God knows, can only be described as, well, forgive me, a tango. And then, in a way that is magic, Brahms interrupts the flow of movement, freezing the harmony, holding us in suspense as distant fanfares approach. And he develops this fanfare idea instantly, as he immediately develops every idea the moment he presents it. Indeed, so rich are Brahms's powers of invention that he makes nonsense of the traditional dividing lines of a symphony. I mean, here we are, only 10 or, 12 dozen bars into the work. We haven't even yet reached what the textbooks would call the development section. And yet every bar that we've encountered so far is in itself an extension, a transformation, a realization, a development, in other words, of something else. Well, but now we do reach the development section proper, and Brahms really goes to town. He takes that little woodwind echo of the movement's main theme, and smooths it out. And compresses it so that the accents get displaced across the bar line. But that's not all. He combines these ideas with reflections of themselves, a mirror image. Meanwhile, there's another idea being mirrored in the same way. Now, these are canons, like Three Blind Mice. In other words, a tune that works when sung by several people, one after the other, and separated by a few beats. But, as we've seen, they are also mirror canons. And when one voice goes up, the other goes down. That, as any composition student will confirm, is a difficult enough puzzle to work out, but Brahms adds yet another canon on top of that. Put all that brain power together, and this is what you get. The interesting thing about a passage of such bewildering intellectual skill is that only the most dedicated professional musician needs to dig into its mechanics. When you listen to the section as a member of an audience, it's over and done within a flash. What, 10, 20 seconds perhaps? Though it's a very impressive 10 or 20 seconds, judged purely as a musical climax, irrespective of the intellectual subtlety that lies behind it. But Brahms also achieves his effects by much simpler ways. Let me show you how he slides us back into the final section of this movement. The technique he employs could not be simpler. He merely stretches out those few notes, B, G, E, C, as in the opening bars of the movement, and the effect is absolutely spellbinding. And so, he lures us back again to the recapitulation, almost without us realizing it. Truly, every note of this work displays a symphonic intellect of immense power, a composer who can, with every justification, be placed way up there in the forefront of composers to rank beside Beethoven, Bach, and Mozart. Yet for years, Brahms shied away from committing himself publicly as a symphonist. And as I said before, he mulled over his first symphony for almost 20 years, conscious of the shadow of Beethoven. He made reference to that shadow. He wrote to Clara Schumann, "I shall never write a symphony. You can't have any idea what it's like to hear such a giant marching behind you." It really is a remarkable burden to have on your shoulders when you come to think of it. And in Brahms's case, more than other romantic artists, it made symphonic writing even more of a challenge, because he truly revered the Beethoven idea of musical development and was drawn naturally to think and create in terms of pure craftsmanship. Let's not pretend for a moment that his contemporaries took their job any less seriously, but they felt drawn to different methods of expression. And when Brahms, for the last movement of his Fourth Symphony, adopted a Baroque technique, the passacaglia, which is a set of variations over a repeated bass line, it must have seemed to the Wagnerians sheer madness. The theme he chose comes from a cantata by Bach, but this is no mere borrowing. As I said at the beginning of this program, when Brahms adopted traditional techniques, it was because they sparked off in him his own inexhaustible powers of invention. This finale is based entirely on an 8-bar theme, presented with immense authority, for this is the moment in the work where he introduces the rich sonority of the trombones for the very first time. That theme, in one guise or another, will recur 31 times without modulating to any other key and without interludes. It appears alternately in high, middle, and low voices. In other words, Brahms has willfully imposed severe constraints upon himself. But within these narrow confines, so resourceful is his ingenuity that he manages to build music of immense force and grandeur. Indeed, the finale is so full of contrast and inventiveness that the technical mastery takes second place to the intensity of the feeling. Let me try to show you how inevitable he makes it all seem and how this movement brings to fulfillment all that's gone before. Do you remember, for instance, that idea from the first movement we heard in the woodwind? Other flashbacks too. Do you remember what the lower strings were up to at the very start of the work? Well, beneath some delightful decoration in the woodwind, here again are those rolling arpeggios. There are so many parallels between the finale and the earlier movements that these similarities, well, they can't be explained away as a coincidence. What is clear is that Brahms, with that marvelous sense of balance, places as much weight and significance on the finale as he did on the opening movement. Earlier generation of symphonists, Haydn, Schubert, Mendelssohn, for example, very often regarded the finale of a symphony as a light-hearted, perhaps boisterous conclusion, full of rollicking, good tunes. But for Brahms, the finale of a symphony was a culmination, a majestic and comprehensive summing up of what has gone on before. Now, in a movement of this length, lasting nearly a quarter of an hour, it's obviously important to create areas of light and shade, to provide moments of repose after opening the movement with such intensity. He does this by grouping his variations into contrasting moods, longer paragraphs, as it were. again, he brings us back into the heroic mood established at the start by the trombones. But what, above all else, unifies this finale, giving it that progressive driving propulsion, is the way Brahms makes one rhythmic idea flow into the next, always with a sense of onward movement. Now here's a section that starts innocently enough, growing in complexity, with the accents placed dramatically on what is normally the weakest beat of the bar, something Brahms loved to do. Then onwards, we're into the final lap, and that we'll save for the moment. The abiding impression you're left with when you listen to this work is not, oh, how clever Brahms has been, how technically ingenious, how brilliant. No, rather it's how honest and how very beautiful. And by that I mean that he never tries to show off or to impress you with his skill, for the simple reason that with him, such impeccable craftsmanship is all part and parcel of what he has to say. The emotion and the technique are one and the same thing. They couldn't be expressed in any other way. In an age of romanticism, that sort of unity eluded many composers. Therefore, the symphonic poem, where the emotional ebb and flow of the story helped dictate the structure, propelling us from one story episode to the next. In our next program, for instance, we shall play Tchaikovsky's Pathétique Symphony, a product of late Romanticism, where the composer had to reconcile his intensely personal and very Russian brand of lyricism within the structural span of an extended and highly emotional composition. But let us conclude this program by playing this Fourth Symphony of Johannes Brahms. It was the last purely orchestral work he was to compose. Whatever his contemporaries liked to say, however much he was ridiculed by Hugo Wolf and George Bernard Shaw and the Wagnerites and the exponents of the new music, we, at this distance, can view this symphony in a clearer light. To us, it is a composition of enormous stature, worthy to rank with Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, a work of central importance in that main symphonic tradition.